Frost still clung to the fence wire when Verlene Odom backed the old flatbed truck toward the barnyard for the ninth day running. She didn't stop to warm her hands. She hooked the chain to another round bale, 400 pounds of cured brome grass, and dragged it into place beside the others. 12 bales already stood shoulder to shoulder in a long, curving wall, taller than her pickup, wrapping around the north side of the barn like the rib of some sleeping animal. She didn't feed a single one of them out, didn't cut the twine, didn't roll them toward the cattle waiting at the fence line, bawling for their morning ration. She just kept stacking bale on bale, wall on wall, while her breath hung in the air and her boots cracked through the skin of ice on every puddle. Neighbors driving past on Route 9 slowed their trucks to stare. Nobody asked her outright what she was doing. They didn't need to. The answer, whatever it was, looked like nothing at all. If you've ever watched somebody work at something that made no sense to anybody but them, you already know there's a story underneath it. Stick with me on this one, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me what part of the country you're watching from tonight. I like knowing where these stories land. Prairie Chapel sits in Loup County, Nebraska, out where the sandhills roll like something the wind never finished shaping. It's the kind of place with one blinking light, a Lutheran church, and a co-op feed store that doubles as the town's parliament. Everybody's business gets discussed over the counter there, whether they like it or not. Verlene had lived on the Odom place for 41 years, married to Hollis Odom, a big quiet man who'd run cattle on that land since before the county paved the road out front. He'd passed 8 months back, sudden, on a Tuesday morning while checking water tanks. What he'd left her wasn't much beyond the herd, the barn, and a stack of hospital bills that had eaten through their savings like mice through a corn crib. She kept the operation going anyway, fed the cattle before sunup, learned to run the ancient baler herself, cussing at it the way Hollis used to. Her granddaughter, Birdie, 9 years old and staying with her since her son's divorce, would sit on the porch step some mornings just to watch her grandmother work, swinging her legs, asking questions Verlene didn't always have the heart to answer. One habit had survived Hollis's death untouched. Every evening, no matter how cold, Verlene walked the fence line with a thermos of coffee, checking each post, each wire, the way he used to. Birdie called it Grandma's rounds. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was the only hour of the day that still felt like it belonged to somebody who knew what she was doing. That fall, a letter came from Cornhusker Mutual Insurance. Verlene read it twice at the kitchen table, Birdie eating cereal across from her, not understanding why her grandmother had gone so still. The policy on the herd and outbuildings, the only insurance standing between the Odom place and total ruin if disaster struck, was up for review. An inspector would come the day after Thanksgiving to check the property against new wind and snow load standards. Pass, and the coverage renewed. Fail and Cornhusker Mutual would drop them cold, no exceptions, 3 weeks before the heart of winter. She couldn't afford to self-insure. Couldn't afford, if she was honest, much of anything since the hospital bills. Losing that policy wasn't an inconvenience. It was the kind of loss that ends a family's hold on land that's been theirs for 3 generations. At the co-op the following Saturday, Odell Kessler leaned on the counter with the particular satisfaction of a man who already knows he's right. Odell ran the feed store and had known Hollis since grade school. "Heard you're stacking bales instead of selling them," he said. "Prices are decent this year, Verlene. You could clear real money instead of building yourself a hay fort." "I've got my reasons," Verlene said, counting out cash for fence staples. "Reasons don't keep the lights on," Odell said, not unkindly, just plain. "Whole town's asking what you're building out there. Some fella at the diner said you're walling yourself in like you're expecting the Almighty himself to come knocking." Verlene almost smiled. "Maybe I am." She didn't explain further, not to Odell, not to anyone. What she was building had come to her slow, over weeks of walking the fence line at dusk, watching how the wind funneled down off the ridge and hammered straight into the barnyard where the cattle sheltered. Hollis used to talk about windbreaks. Real ones, not the scraggly cedar row planted decades back. Half of it dead now, but something solid enough to break a hard wind cold. She couldn't afford lumber. Couldn't afford steel panels, not with the hospital bills still eating 20% of every check she brought in from what little cattle she'd sold. But she had bales. Round bales, hundreds of pounds each, dense enough to stop a gale if you stacked them right, in the right shape, in the right place. A wall of hay wasn't just a wall of hay. Packed tight, 2 bales high in places, it could turn a killing wind into a whisper. So she built. Morning to dusk, she dragged bales from the far field where they'd sat curring since August, arranging them in a long curving barrier that hugged the barn's north and west faces, then swung out to shelter the water tank and the low corner of pasture where the herd bunched during storms. She left gaps for the cattle to move through, funneling them toward the barn's leeward side. It was engineering built from instinct and 40 years of watching her husband read weather. Bertie helped where a 9-year-old could, fetching twine cutters, hauling water, keeping tally of the bales in a little notebook. "Are we building a castle?" she asked one afternoon, breath clouding in the cold. "Something like that," Verlene said. "Who's it keeping out?" Verlene looked west toward a sky the color of an old bruise. Weather mostly. 3 weeks before Tull's inspection, disaster struck the project itself. A freezing rain moved through overnight, coating the half-finished wall in a skin of ice before Verlene could add the final course of bales. By morning, the bales she'd already placed had frozen solid to each other and to the ground, locked into position good for strength. But the outer bales meant for the top row had frozen through as well, brittle and waterlogged, unusable. Worse, the old baler, straining under the workload, threw a belt that afternoon and wouldn't turn over no matter what she tried. She stood in the yard that evening with grease on her hands and no bales left to finish the job, the wall standing at barely 2/3 the height she needed, gaps still open on the exposed north corner. For the first time since Holly's died. Verlene sat down on an overturned bucket in the cold and let herself feel how far behind she was. Bertie found her there and didn't say anything. She just sat down beside her on the frozen ground. "Grandpa would have known how to fix the baler," Bertie finally said. "He would have," Verlene agreed. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked to the shed. If she couldn't bale more hay, she'd finish the wall with what stood in the far field already. Loose stacks Hollies had left standing 2 years back, weathered but sound. It would mean hauling by hand, bale by bale, on a hand truck, through 8 inches of standing snow. She started that night, working by the flatbed's headlights. Word passed through Prairie Chapel the way it does in small places, through the diner, through the pews, through Odell's counter. Most folks figured the widow Odom had finally cracked under the strain of running that place alone. A few, quietly, without saying so out loud, began keeping half an eye on the sky along with her, the way farm people do when something in their gut won't settle. By the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the wall stood finished, uneven in places, patched with mismatched bales but complete, wrapping the barnyard in a long, unbroken curve of packed hay standing higher than a man's head. Verlene walked its length in the fading light, running a bare hand along the rough twine, feeling for gaps the wind might find. Inside the curve, the cattle stood calm, chewing, sheltered from a wind that howled openly across every other pasture in the county. The forecast turned 2 days early. Not the light snow the county had been promised, but a hard, freezing rain riding in ahead of an Arctic front, the kind of ice storm that came through Loup County once a decade and left power lines on the ground for a week. It struck Wednesday night, hours before Garrison Tull was ever due to arrive with his clipboard and his wind load charts. By midnight the whole county was sheeted in ice. Branches snapped under the weight of it, cracking like rifle shots across the dark. Wind came down off the ridge exactly the way Hollies always said it would, funneling straight into the low ground where the Odom barnyard sat, and slammed instead into a wall of frozen hay 2 bales thick, curling up and over it, spending its worst fury on packed grass instead of living animals. Verlene didn't sleep. She and Bertie sat wrapped in quilts by the kitchen window, watching ice needles sideways past the porch light, listening to the wind scream against the barn. And beneath that scream, the low, steady sound of cattle standing quiet in the lee of the wall, undisturbed, unbothered, chewing hay in the dark like the storm outside belonged to some other world. Morning came gray and glass-bright, every fence wire wearing an inch of clear ice, the whole county silent under the wreckage. Odell Kessler drove out early, not to check on Verlene's foolish wall, but because his own herd, left in open pasture behind a scraggly cedar row, had scattered in the night, drifting downwind through a gap in his fence. 3 head found frozen where they'd huddled against a hillside with no shelter at all. He came up the Odom Drive expecting the same story, maybe worse, given all that time she'd wasted stacking hay instead of feeding it out. What he found instead stopped his truck in the yard. Every Odom cow stood alive inside the curve of frozen bales, steam rising off their backs, calm as Sunday, while the wall itself stood scarred with ice but unbroken, holding a drift line clean as a ruler along its outer face where the wind had piled snow instead of cattle. Garrison Tull arrived an hour later, chains on his tires, clipboard forgotten somewhere on the passenger seat once he saw the yard. He walked the length of the wall twice, running his glove along the ice-glazed hay, checking the drift patterns against the barn, against the water tank still thawed and running behind its wind shadow. Neighbors began drifting up the drive by mid-morning, drawn by the same word that had traveled through Prairie Chapel all fall, only meaning something different now. Come see what the widow built. They stood in small clusters at the edge of the yard, quiet, looking at a barrier none of them had taken seriously a month before, now standing as the only thing on that stretch of road that had done exactly what it was built to do. Tull renewed the policy on the spot, scribbling notes about wind mitigation. The insurance handbook had never quite pictured looking like this. Odell stayed longest of anyone, standing at the fence with his hat off despite the cold, watching Verlene's cattle graze calm in the lee of a wall built from bales he'd once told her to sell. He didn't say much, just helped her haul water to the tank, the two of them working in the kind of silence that says more than most conversations manage. Bertie sat on the fence rail nearby, notebook open on her knee, counting bales in the wall the way she'd counted them going up, weeks before, when nobody else believed there was any sense in the number. The insurance held. The herd came through without losing a single head, the only operation in that stretch of Loop County that could say so. Verlene never made much of it afterward, didn't take the compliments Odell offered at the co-op the following spring, didn't dwell on the 2 neighbors who quietly asked her, come summer, how a person went about building a wall like that. She just kept walking her fence line every evening, thermos in hand, the way Holly's always had, past a curve of weathered hay standing exactly where she'd left it, no longer strange to look at, no longer needing explaining to anyone who'd lived through that one long, ice-bright night. Some walls get built out of nothing anybody else can see coming, until the wind finds out different.